Hi there, welcome to the Raven's Call. I'm Eric Wordweaver Sjerven, Goldie of the Ridgar folk here in East Texas, and I'd like to welcome you to the show. This is a show where I ramble on about different heathen-related subjects, just kind of whatever strikes my fancy, sets my mind on fire at the time. And bit of housekeeping stuff we do beforehand, big UPG warning. This channel is my take on things, my take on heathenry. I'm not a hardcore recon, not a fluffy bunny. You can look at some of my previous videos to kind of get a take on my take of heathenry. Very much a modern heathen, just trying to find my heathenry in the modern world. I'm not trying to recreate something that was done thousands of years ago, but I do take my inspiration from it, and I do pay attention to research and developments there, but I also allow for organic growth and development in the modern day, finding heathenry today in our world, because this is where we live and this is what we do. So, very much about the Vertandi, the Norn of the now. So, other housekeeping stuff, please, if you guys enjoy the videos, subscribe, ding the bell, all that fun stuff. My contact information is down below. You'll find email, all that kind of stuff, Facebook group. There's a Facebook fan page up now. You just search Wordweaver Productions and you'll find it. That's a good way to keep up to date on all of my postings and things like that. I use that as my route and then share it out to other avenues like the Wordweaver Productions community group, where there's discussions and conversations going on. A lot of community building, things like that. You'll find my Twitter down there. You'll also find a mailing address if you guys wanted to send in like fan mail, art, things like that, whatever you might find. It's a P.O. Box. You'll see it listed down below. So, housekeeping stuff out of the way. Let's go ahead and jump into today's subject. Now, today's subject is one that was born from a conversation I had recently at at one of my park moots. And you guys are familiar with my park moots and everything, as I've talked about them on the channel before. We've kind of shown some interviews from those before, and I love the conversations that come up there. And this is one that's been stewing in my head for a while, and I decided, hey, let's throw it out to the group and let's talk about the subject in a grand scale. And the reason for that is because I had a question posited to me by email at one point in time. I cannot remember your name, please do forgive me. But this individual asked me, and it's not going to be a word for word on the request because it has been some time. I wanted to take some time to really kind of think this one out. This was a reaction to some of the infighting and everything that's been occurring online. A lot of hate speech going around, a lot of just fighting, general infighting amongst different tribes and different people, specifically individuals online mostly. A lot of the negativity and things like that. And they wanted me to approach the idea of kind of a live and let live, love all kind of approach to heathenry, to advocate peace amongst individuals, and to, it's difficult for me to phrase it in a way that makes a lot of sense. And so it got me to thinking, well, I mean, conflict in and of itself is a thing that's, it's inherent in humankind. And so I don't necessarily advocate this idea of globalized peace, of everyone getting along. There's a lot of things that grow out of discourse, out of arguments and things like that. Some growth definitely occurs there, but of course there are limitations to that, and there are things that are important that we keep in mind, a civil head, a civil tongue kind of thing, but discourse can definitely be a thing. But then I took it further and began thinking about, that conflict being inherent within humanity. And I began to wonder, well, why is conflict inherent in humanity? I mean, we continue to have wars, we continue to have battles of all kinds. There's definitely been strife between organizations of individuals since there have been organizations of individuals. Social constructs war against other social constructs for various and sundry reasons. And no attempt in the history of mankind to do away with that has ever been truly successful or sustainable. And I began to wonder why. Why is world peace not attainable? Why is it not a thing? And should it even be a thing? And that's a difficult subject to get into because a lot of people have got a lot of emotions tied up into it. But I want to take emotion out of it and talk about just some of the key elements from a heathen perspective as to approach with regards to this idea of world peace, and why I, for one, don't really think that it's a thing. Why I don't think it's necessarily a possibility. And the reason that I see that is because the world was created in the prima sacrifice, the very first sacrifice, was Odin, Vili, and Ve when they slew Ymir and used Ymir's body and blood to create the world around us, Midgard and the worlds. It's all forged from the corpse of Ymir, the prima giant. And in this prima sacrifice, the world is forged from blood and bone in an act of violence. An act of violence springs up and gives birth to the world that we know. In this, violence is in the DNA of the world. It is in the DNA, in the blood of the world around us. It is an essential thing for a number of reasons, but it is not a pretty thing. It's not a glorified thing. It is a function of the system that the gods have put into place. And the gods themselves were gods of war in some elements. Some of the gods are. And so it is definitely within their realm. I mean, anyone that knows anything about Odin or Thor or Tyr will know that war is very much a part of their persona. It's very much a part of what they are. It is not the summation of what they are, but it is very much a piece of it. It's very much a part of it. And there is a place within society for the warriors. There is this warrior ethos that is an essential part of mankind and the mentality of mankind that is not, again, the summation of mankind. It is not the identifying factor, but it is an element of humanity. And the reason for that being that we as humans are born of Ashken Embla. We were born of creations from Midgard. We were taken from the bones of Midgard and given body, form, shape, mentality, and the gift of divine madness from the gods. And we are given the ability to create and destroy. Now, from a scientific standpoint of things, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. It simply is. It can change shape, it can change formation, but it cannot be created and it cannot be destroyed. It simply shifts. And energy, same way. Law of conservation of energy, law of conservation of matter. Each one is sustaining. Each one remains. It doesn't, despite better efforts, it can be broken down to its atomic bases, but those atomic building blocks still remain. No matter how big the bomb is, no matter how hard you hit it with the hammer, while you may no longer recognize the thing as what it was before, the base elements of what it is still remain. So, that being said, creation and growth are only possible through the destruction of something pre-existing, the rearrangement of matter. And even within, my particular views with regards to the way science and heathenry interact. I mean, if you look at, for example, my bit there about Ashken Embla, you're going to see this my correlation with evolution as far as us coming from the natural world and being shaped by the gods into what we have become. And this is a mixture of evolution and divine guidance. I see the two as being both parts of a whole and essentially being, one system, which is why I do not see a disconnect between science and heathenry, which is not necessarily something that other people share, but it is something that I see. I see the science as being our explanation of the world around us that was gifted to us by the gods. Science is one of the tools they gifted us with in order to be able to understand this world we have inherited. Now, that being said, like I said, we come from that. Law of conservation of energy, law of conservation of matter. These things cannot be created or destroyed. Life is sustained through the absorption of life. The natural progression of the natural world. If you take humanity out of it alone and look simply at the natural world, the world of the Vetir, violence is very much a part of that. Predators eat prey. Herbivores eat of the vegetation and the land. And they absorb that, and it becomes part of them, and they become part of the predators, and the predators eventually die, and they become eaten by the carrion eaters and bacteria and fungus and all these things, and broken down into their core elements, return to the earth, where they become part of the land, and then they become part of the plants, which then are eaten by the herbivores. Circle of life. The system is as it is, and it is as set out by the gods. Now, the gods themselves are said to have gone to war. The Aesir warred with the Vanir, the gods of order, with more naturalistic gods of the land, and a treaty was struck. Rules were set out by which they would function and operate together. They were bound together by marriage, or at least by the exchange of individuals. There's a couple of different interpretations on Freya as being sent over, as well as Freya and Freya. I sometimes still use the word Freya because it's more recognizable by the viewing audience, but Freya and Freya, and of course Njord being sent over. And then you've got Mimir and I think it was Honir was sent over from the Aesir. Anyway, I have to go back and fact check myself on that one. But the gist here being that, you know, a treaty was struck and rules were set forth, and the world continued to operate by those rules. The system that the gods worked out with our gods, with the Vanir, and the now joined tribes. And, you know, lions eat. There is violence out there in the world. And if you were to remove said violence, then things would still die and things would still fall, but it would be due to entropy and due to decay and due to the machinations of Nidhogg. Now, if you look therein as far as this contestation between life and death, this the living and the decay, with entropy being a force, you know, Nidhogg, which I see as, you know, the eater beneath the tree, the great serpent, dragon, however you interpret the lore on that one. Nidhogg being at the root of Yggdrasil and constantly gnawing at the roots, is chaos, constantly trying to revert order back to chaos. And the tree, of course, continues to feed upon depths which no man may know, and continues to grow and develop. Even in the Ragnarok cycle, which depends on how much you give credence to the Ragnarok cycle, given the, you know, propensity for syncretism and whatnot in that regard, you see a rebirth afterwards. It is not a destruction of all things and, you know, return to Ginnungagap. Even in all of that, Ginnungagap in the beginning was a yawing void, but is not necessarily a nothingness, because Muspelheim and Niflheim still existed to give form to the ice that gave form to Ymir, that threw past Bor and Buri, and then of course Odin Ve to slay Ymir, etc., etc., etc. You guys are familiar with the lore. So it's a thing. It's in the lifeblood of our mythology. It's in the lifeblood of our very existence. So, you know, being that it's so intrinsic even from a mythological level down to the very core of humanity, violence is an essential thing with regards to self-preservation, with regards to protection of kith and kin, with regards to the ability to put food on the table, to hunt, to fish, to, you know, harvest even. These are, you know, the threshing of grain is an act of violence. It's, you know, we don't necessarily correlate it in the same way because it's not tied to like human on human interaction, but it is still a forcible harvesting. And so there is a core element of violence therein. So violence is in the DNA of the world. I do not think it can ever be truly excised. However, it is also something that is misused. It is something that is abused within the world around us. And that is always going to be the way. The only thing that stands between us and the bad men are good men willing to do violence. And that is that's one of the core things of the warrior ethos. They are there to protect and to, you know, see to the survival of those that they love. And I think that's an essential thing, especially when it is examined from a true, you know, what is the essence of this kind of approach? Not in that we're going to go out and conquer element, but in that, really base, we are here to defend those that we care the most about. Because from a tribal identity aspect, imperialism and tribalism don't necessarily mix. When you go out there and you try to grow beyond a certain bound, what you end up with in the end is unsustainable. If you look at the history of just humankind, imperialism almost always fails. Communism almost always, communism always fails. Socialism, same thing. There's not a system that is eternal. There's not a system that makes it forever. There's not a system that is sustainable on a large scale eternally. It doesn't work that way. Chaos theory would state that no matter how simple the system in place, once it's repeated upon itself enough times, it will eventually collapse under its own weight. It is, of course, a paraphrase, but it's the gist of some of the elements, not all of it. And that's the thing. That's Nidhogg at work. That's entropy. That's a natural part of the world is going to decay and fall in on itself. No structure stands forever. They can stand for an extended period of time, especially if they do not extend beyond their means. If they don't expand to a point that they can no longer sustain themselves, then it can last for a long time. A tribe can last for a very long time, as long as they don't try to get too big too fast, as long as they don't overreach their capacity. And that's where violence a lot of times is misused. The application of force for gain. You're looking at, war between different tribes, war between different nations, and there's a disconnect between a lot of it. The use of violence is a tool just like anything else. It's a natural force within the world. And I do see a misuse of it on a grand scale in the modern day. There is a disconnect with violence. There is modern warfare has gotten to the point where it's not as personal as it used to be. I mean, back in the ancestors' days, when you would step out onto the battlefield, you had sword and shield, and you looked your opponent in the eye, and it was gruesome, it was terrifying, it was bloody, and it was scarring. It was a horrible thing. From a meta standpoint, population was kept in check in a lot of ways because of it. People didn't reach out beyond what they could handle, and if they did, then they would fail and fall back. Great countries that took on an imperial stance back in the day. Take a look at England, for example. England was very empirical for a long time, expanded well beyond their capacity to maintain, and the empire collapsed. Rome, same kind of thing. Japan, similar stuff. You get some of these empires that overreach and try to do too much. Even if they reach the outer edges of their capacity and then try to sustain, what ends up happening is entropy kicks in and corruption occurs within a government, things like that, and these eventually fall in on themselves. So at which point in time, violence comes in the form of revolution, wherein the downtrodden individuals rise up and protect themselves against a tyrannical government. They fight for their freedom, they fight for their survival, they fight for these things, they fight for those that matter the most to them. And I am not one who's going to stand here and tell someone, no, don't fight. Fight for what matters the most, but fight for the right reasons, and fight when it is appropriate. I'm not a big fan of the imperialistic gain. I'm not a big fan of trying to reach out beyond our means. I'm not looking to take my tribe and go raiding neighboring tribes to get their stuff. If it came down to, a neighboring tribe invading ours, then yeah, of course we would have to defend ourselves. But this isn't the old days. This is the modern day, and there are legal stopgaps on national levels and state levels and city levels and things like that to help protect against those things. But I'm still an advocate for protecting your homestead, for protecting your home, your hearth. That's a thing. You need to be able to protect what is important to you, and you can't depend on anyone else to defend it for you unless they come from within your tribe and they are a part of your hearth or your frithweb. That's where I see that level of trust occurring. Trusting some enigmatic state government to protect you when things get in the thick of it, can be folly. It's not necessarily what those are there in place for. Not really. It's like the military's job is to protect interests of the nation, not necessarily to police the individuals within the nation, kind of thing. And that's a big thing. You get into nationalities and whatnot, and this is part of the disconnect element. You've got these grand nations that are so big and so spread out that there is a disconnect between the people. Yes, technically I am, I'm a United States citizen, and therefore I am part of the same nation as someone from Rhode Island, and same as someone from California. However, I don't know these people. I'm not tied to these people in any way, shape, form, or fashion, other than the fact that we are part of the United States of America. And so our interests do not connect. Our interests do not align, and we're not one people. My tribe is my people, my immediate community, those are my people. So there's already a disconnect there, amongst the members of the nation in and of themselves. There's some vague sense of nationality, pride in being an American, pride in being a Canadian, pride in being a Mexican, pride in being a Spaniard, pride in being Norwegian, Danish, whatever it might be. And I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. But there is a disconnect, and there is, if you go back to kind of my false kinship ideas, there is an element of false kinship that occurs therein. And that's a factor of modern day that we just have to live with and have to work with. That's why forging heathenry in the modern day is somewhat difficult, because we end up with, trying to build these tribal identities within a bigger machine whose design is to eliminate a lot of those individual idiosyncratic elements that make up these individual cultures. It's a thing. It's very difficult. When you're trying to build a tribe in an area, but you don't have the sovereignty that a tribe would have had back in the day, because you're all under city ordinances, state ordinances, things like that. So we continue to do what we can, and we build what we can within it, but we are in a lot of ways limited on how we can defend ourselves and what we can do to protect what is ours, especially in a country where it tells you, largely a lot of the political rhetoric is, don't defend, let the police do it, let the army do it. It's like, well, but ultimately speaking, when you get down to it, the only one who is responsible for protecting your Renengard is you. So defend your people, stand up and, watch out for your homes, things like that. But to advocate for world peace is to chase a thing that is unattainable, I think, largely because it's just not in the DNA of humankind. It's not in the DNA of Midgard as a whole. Ever since Ymir, I don't think it's been possible. And I don't think it needs to be either. I think there's a reason that that particular element still exists. I think there's a reason that war is still a thing within the human mind. I know some good guys who are doing a lot of research on warrior ethos, and there's some very fascinating stuff coming out of there, and I think it's extremely important because it does explore the whys, the real whys behind it, not some, we're going to war with this nation over oil rights and things like that, not some big political machination element. We're not talking about invading other countries and trying to, gain their goods, etc., etc., etc. We're not talking about, greedily raiding nearby neighboring villages to get their goods because we don't have enough, or just because we simply want more, the greedy part. No, we're talking about defending our own. We're talking about stepping up and protecting our people, and the whys for that, the mentality that goes behind that, not this modern push for this hyper-masculine, romanticized warrior kind of cult that has arisen, the very Brosatru kind of approach that comes from that disconnect between violence and the reason for violence. So I don't think advocating for world peace is necessarily the way to go, personally. Keep in mind, this is just my personal views. I'm not advocating one way or the other in a grand scheme of things. I'm not trying to incite anyone to violence by any means. What I would rather encourage is the enlightened mind to explore this mentality of the warrior for what it was and what it needs to be, what the core essence of the warrior is, what the warrior role plays within the world, and to see the value that comes from it, because it is an essential part. It is an essential part of society. It is an essential part of survival. Given fight or flight, these are the ones that will stand and fight. These are the ones that stand in the face of the natural human inclination to preserve their own lives. They will put their own lives on the line in order to protect those around them and those that matter the most to them. These are the individuals that actively overcome those mental stopgaps that are put in place in order to put themselves in harm's way to protect those that matter the most. Now, I have mad respect for our armed forces, mad respect. There's a lot of ways that I think the United States military fails our armed soldiers when they come home, and I really wish that there was a lot we could. There is a lot. I really wish there's more that we as a society would do to help them reintegrate and to support them and to recognize the role that they play. Because when you're talking about a warrior and a warrior mentality, a warrior ethos, you're talking about something that is aside from society. You're talking about something that exists. It's an entirely different mindset. It's an entirely different role within society. It's a set-aside aspect. You look into a lot of things like Mannerbund and things like that, you will see, like, look at the Jomsvikings and whatnot, and you're looking at warrior cults that were set aside from society in order to do what they needed to do. Now, reintegration from that to this, from armed soldier life to civilian life, is we're failing at that as a nation. The United States is failing at that in a large way, which is why I would like to see tribes step up for their individual members that have served and support them as best they can, to be there for them, to lend an ear when they need, to help find resources when those individuals need some extra help. Because in the olden days, per se, there wasn't this, necessarily go to the warrior cult and then come back to, be a farmer and things like that. A lot of times in a lot of societies, it was kind of a permanent shift. When you were a warrior, and that's what you did. And that was not necessarily an over-specialization, but it was definitely, that was your role within the society until you just couldn't do it anymore, and then you train new warriors, kind of thing. And again, it doesn't necessarily, there's no broad sweeping generalities to this. It's different for each culture, but the core essence of what a warrior is fairly universal. Unless it's misapplied, misappropriated, and you have individuals in power wielding that for nefarious and dark means, which is what our warriors, sorry, there's a sound in the other office, which is what our warriors are there to do, is to help protect us against those individuals. So it's a thing. I would really like to see a better approach to supporting our armed forces when they come home, the men and women who go out there and put their lives on the line, that step out into this alternate mentality and then face things that we as civilians probably will never face in our lives. And after a fashion, that in and of itself is part of the big disconnect. We have divided it so much that a lot of the violence of, the real world, as it were, a lot of the violence that occurs out there, we are shielded from. And as a result, smaller acts of violence within what seems like a safe stead are devastating to us because we're not prepared for it. We're not prepared necessarily to defend ourselves. We're not prepared to process that kind of information. When war would touch tribes back in the day and everyone was involved, it was a very real thing. It wasn't this distanced thing. I mean, even if you look at just the fact of disconnect from death, humankind is heavily now being further and further disconnected from the concept and reality of death. Life expectancies have grown to such an extent with medical aid and whatnot that death is not as prevalent a thing in our daily lives. You know, we're not raising livestock and having to kill it ourselves. We're not faced with farm life where, you know, individuals may die unexpectedly and too early. We're not, you know, with the life expectancies being what they are, we're not seeing elderly die at younger ages, which, you know, it's spreading all of that out. So instead of having a life where death is very much a part of it, you have a huge chunk of your life where death is not as prevalent, where it's not as there. And as a result, you're not prepared to deal with it. Similarly to, you know, nursing homes and things like that, this disconnect between the tribe, the hearths, and the elderly, the elders, where they're not, you know, you're not there in the tribe hearthstead watching these individuals pass. A lot of times it happens in a hospital. A lot of times it happens in a nursing home or hospice. All good services, but ultimately speaking, there is a natural kind of disconnect that's occurring as a result of that. And it's, I think a lot of times it's because technology makes it too convenient not to have to deal with that. And so, you know, it happens. And I don't necessarily see that as a good thing. And it's not to condemn the technology at play. It's not to condemn the extension of you know, life expectancy and whatnot. But, you know, as people, we need to be more cognizant. As people, we need to be more involved. We need to be there. And that's something that I see as a major disconnect in modern society, is that we are stepping aside and letting technology and the system at large handle things that are just unpleasant and that we do not want to deal with. You know, those that are magic users will know that magic has both the light and dark elements, but it's not necessarily a light or dark thing. It's all kind of rolled into one. There's lighter and darker aspects of it, but it's all within a kind of continuum, and that's similar to life, you know. There's lighter and darker aspects of life, but it's all part of the same continuum, and we need to deal with it, and we need to be prepared to deal with that. A lot of what we've done with society today is distance ourselves to such an extent that we are not prepared, that we are not ready to deal with the losses, and we're not ready to deal with the vulgarity of violence and the after effects of it. This false sense of security and safety that arises causes a lot of people to, when violence does occur, to be so shell-shocked by it because they are so unprepared that they are catatonic in a lot of ways, unable to truly deal with what's going on. So that doesn't mean that we all, you know, the whole question started from individuals and the infighting and everything that we see on the internet. That's mostly silly, stupid stuff that people are taking up verbal arms about, and it is not in even nearly the same realm. And when you step back and look at those things from a kind of meta level, when you're looking at, you know, the world at large and this element of both entropy and violence and how they're part of the DNA, just like life and growth and creation are. All of the light and dark are both parts of the same coin. You know, it's the heads and tails. It's both sides of the same coin. You know, a lot of that stuff suddenly falls into place, and you realize this is silly. We're arguing over stupid stuff and getting really, really out there and spreading a lot of hate stuff that's just not necessary. It really isn't, and it's missing the point, you know. It's not important. You know, we're getting in major arguments online, and some of that may simply be because there's not an outlet for that inherent nature in a lot of individuals. And like any system, a lot of human natural systems, if you look at it like a boiler, if you plug off a boiler and you shut all of the relief valves, the pressure continues to build until it pops, and it will pop at the weakest joint. That applies to so many human systems, it's not even funny. That's very much a thing here, and if there's not an outlet, that's why we see things pop up where there are outlets for that. There's, you know, sporting events that are very physical. There's UFC, there's, you know, martial arts, there's boxing, fencing, there's all these different sports that allow a certain outlet for that because it is part of the human being. And as such, you know, it needs some kind of outlet. We try to find ways within society that it's acceptable, that this outlet can be attained without necessarily being a hindrance on society or being toxic in and of itself. It's a thing, you know, it really is a thing. And so we continue to build, we continue to do, and we continue to, sadly, disconnect in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people would benefit from really thinking about this. I don't necessarily think that, you know, everybody suddenly needs to be thrust into this thing. Not some doomsday kind of guy. But I do think that we need to be cognizant of these elements, and especially within heathenry. And in general, it's kind of a sociological take on things, but I mean, within heathenry in and of itself, looking at tribal dynamics, you're looking at a mythological level, you're looking at a society level. It's there, it's a thing. And if we want to be better for our tribes, if we want to be, want our tribes to succeed and to persevere and to see a future, then we need to understand all of the elements of the world as a tribe and, you know where we stand within it, you know. I'm not saying every tribe needs to go out and develop some warrior cult within there that's ready to do war at any point in time, but knowing how to defend yourself is an important thing. Knowing how to harvest from the land and how to hunt, it's an important thing. You know, knowing how to defend yourself if you are attacked by a bear, if you live in areas where there are bears, it's an act of violence. It's a thing. It's a part of humanity, and it's a part of being in Midgard and part of being in the world. Technology has allowed us to step back from that so far that sometimes we lose sight of that. And there's a lot of things, like the last video that I did on the decay and the degradation of the sense of family. Again, definitely fueled by technology in a lot of ways, because convenience has allowed us to not have to engage in that. You know, convenience has allowed us to be distracted by things, and as such, a lot of the things that are truly important aren't seen to in the ways that they need to be. We're not aware of them. So I'm not really advocating anything with this particular video. The only thing that I'm really saying is think about stuff, you know, look at things from a different point of view and really get down to my big thing, the why. You know, why does this exist? Why is it a thing? Why is it there? And I'm very much about removing emotion from it, because it's not an emotional system. It's, you know, the cycle of life on Midgard is not an emotional thing. Emotions don't come into play except, you know, as natural outcomes of what occurs within that system. But it's hard for people to divest themselves from the emotional side of things, especially when all they have is caricaturized, over glorified views or overly demonized views of what's at play. You get individuals that overly glorify warfare, that overly identify with this you know, aggressiveness, and they end up becoming individuals that really have no place in society, because they can't integrate. They have turned themselves into something that does not function within their own society. And it's a sad thing to see, but it is a thing. And so on the flip side, you see those that abhor it to such an extent that they are constantly living in shell shock. They're constantly in a reactionary state. They live constantly in the flight aspect of fight or flight. Whereas the others live constantly in the fight aspect of fight or flight, and none of them sit down and just live. And that's a thing. And so when you get these individuals crossing wires online in a society, in a system that, you know, is so removed that you can say anything and do anything, and there's no real immediate fear of repercussion, things get stupid really fast. And it's kind of a sad thing. You know, there's a lot of this that if there wasn't online forums and things like that, if we were still doing, you know, at-home tribal stuff, we wouldn't even be having these conversations, because it's just a part of daily life. And so, you know, that's just something to kind of keep in mind if we are going to continue to try to build heathenry in the modern day, that we need to recognize where modern technology and modern advances per se, have led us become too complacent, or led us to be too distanced from a thing, and to know that we need to keep an element of that in mind. After World War I, World War II, there were not a whole lot of individuals on the face of the planet that weren't intimately touched by war. Nowadays, there's entire generations that have never known that kind of existence, that have never known that need to be ready, that kind of all of the things that went along with that. And it's good from an emotional standpoint that they don't have to go through that, but it also means they're ill prepared when something like that comes knocking at their door again. So it's cyclical, it'll shift, and things occur that shift our focus back and forth, but we also allow political rhetoric, fear-mongering, and things like that to chase us away from what really matters, to focus on big sweeping movements on national levels that don't tend to the hearth, that don't tend to the home. And there's control that tries to occur on both sides, and playing the game ultimately leads to a weakening of the homestead and the hearthstead. So again, trying not to get too particularly political, but that is an outgrowth of things. Politicalness is an aspect of why a lot of this disconnect has occurred. A lot of bad information, a lot of misinformation, a lot of manipulation, both of fact and emotion, occurs daily. The propaganda machine in the United States is ridiculously active and so much more effective than anything that was ever seen during World War II. China is a great example of that. America, oh wow. You've got warring propagandas all under one, kind of general leaderhead. It's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. And so, I try to tend to home. I try to tend to my hearthstead, and I try to protect my hearthstead, and I try to look after my people. That's really where my focus is. Hashtag grassroots heathenry all the way. And that's grassroots with my life. That's grassroots with just about everything, because that's where it matters. That's where the important stuff is. So, yeah. Anyway, that's enough on this particular subject. I've rambled on for quite a while. The gist of the whole thing is that arguing on the internet is stupid. Yeah, we can have discourse. Yes, we can argue about which translation we like better. Heck, we can argue about whether or not the last episode of the show we watched was absolute shite, or if it was a great episode. We can do all that stuff, but none of that none of that matters. It's fun. That's the thing. A lot of people have fun in the argument because it's an outlet. A lot of people enjoy it, and that's fine. That's fine. Debate is a thing. Societies have done that forever. The fluting is a thing. I mean, that's Archheathens did it. Absolutely. Fluting was an art form back in the day. Who could most masterfully insult and challenge the other individual, and how well did they, respond to that? It's a verbal boxing match. It was the original rap battles kind of thing. This has gone on forever because these outlets need to exist, and they will continue to need to exist, and we'll continue to find ways to give them voice and to give them a space. And the internet is one of those. People just take it too seriously. That's the problem. There's so much more important things going on out in the world out there, and everybody's got their opinions on it, and I'm sure I'm going to hear stuff as a result of this, but whatever. The gist is we need to keep in mind what's actually important, and that is hearth and home, and taking care of those that are the most important to you, and being there for the people that are most important to you. So anyway, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Give me feedback. Let me know what you guys want to hear about. Try to do some more informational stuff as opposed to my my weird rambles that I've been doing here recently. Just a couple of rants that I felt like I needed to get on for a particular reason or another. So give me feedback. Let me know what you guys like, what you want to hear, what you want to talk about, and we'll go from there. If you've got questions, if you want to hear me just ramble on a specific subject, let me know. I've got some cool recommendations that have kind of come into my inbox, but they're going to take a little bit of prep work from me. So I'm gonna work on those for a little bit, see where they go. So anyway, in the meantime, thank you all. Hail. May your hearth fires burn bright. All right, we're going to try and do this again. Had to kind of go back to the drawing board on a couple of things. So I'm going to try, I'm going to try and do, time check. Got to see what I've got because I've still got work and stuff to do. So, all right, we're going to give this a shot. This is going to be episode 107, I think, is where we're at. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, this is Raven's Call, obviously. We're going to talk about the world peace thing, and I'm going to see what I can do with that. All right. So we're live in 3, 2, 1. Let's jam. And interruption. Crap. 3, 2, 1. No. Pause. 3, 2, 1. Go. We're not, faced with, a farm life that may have freak accidents and, someone die far too young. Pause. Hello? Junk call, I swear. All right. We're back in 3, 2, 1. Let's jam.